Welcome, students. This is the second part of the lecture on the topic identities and inequalities in digital spaces. And in this part, I'm going to talk about some of these dynamics of identities and inequalities, particularly in the form of a digital platform or digital space. So, and in that context, I will be talking about, ideas of algorithm, ideas of search engines, not just as products of technology, but also as products of technology situated in particular social contexts. So, when you look at physical space and compare it with the understanding of a digital space, and I used the example of a physical geographical space in the previous part of my lecture, um, you see that there are certain socio-cultural practices and contexts that shape people's practice and the use of the digital are sort of brought into the question, brought into the purview of the scope of the inquiry. And the ways in which socio-demographic social determinants and electronic device use and influence digital spaces are also something that falls within this scope of inquiry. So what happens is that there is this discursive space that you just saw in the previous part of the lecture of Bourdieu's idea of the habitus and discursive space, and there is also the idea of praxis, and praxis also comes from the same strain of ideas of action-oriented, agency-oriented functions. And the fourth idea that comes into the question is the idea of scale. And the idea of scale is something that I also discussed in the previous part of this topic. So when you look at the transition from a physical to a digital space, one of the first things that comes into the question is that is creating a digital space the same as replicating a physical space? In other words, would we be looking at the space on a digital platform the same way that we would have been looking at something in its physical form? So, and herein comes in the question of programming. Now, programming apparently looks like a very, sort of technology skill set oriented sort of an activity that if you are trained in a particular programming language, then you are able to do coding and programming and so on and so forth. But in this context, what is important for us to remember is to program is also to mean to specify an exact sequence of commands for execution in a machine. And that sort of exactness, it opposes the abstract approach of design at first glance. So in a previous lecture, I've talked about space as being an abstract concept. It is all continuously produced. It's not a given. And so when we talk of programming a digital space, the idea, the fact that we have to give an exact set of commands to the machine to perform and give us a result sort of comes in opposition to the exact oppositeness of how we understand space. And from here, it's a very interesting journey that takes from here, that how then is, we are going to make meaning of digital spaces using this lens. So what needs to be, sort of thought about in this context is the idea of computational thinking. And this is an idea that runs at the very, very foundation of creating a digital space. So computational thinking is deploying principles of computer programming to digital spaces in order to solve given problems. And, this is an overarching definition of computational thinking, and it includes, for example, the idea of algorithms. So, what are algorithms? Very simply defined as structured sequence of steps to create an output from an input. And this is exactly, how algorithms would function also. That, you would give a structured sequence of steps to the machine, to the computer, to create an output based on what you have put as input, right? So, this, when you translate to the idea of computational thinking, and now bring in the ideas of techne and phronesis, something that we have covered in the first topic. So, just to recap, techne, as we had talked about, is the technical knowledge, the know-how of writing an algorithm, for example. That is, do I have the skill set or do I have the technical knowledge to write an algorithm? Can I, or do I have the skill set to actually give this structured sequence of steps to the computer in a language that the computer understands in order to give me an output based on what I've given as input? So this is the techne, this is the technical knowledge, the know-how. But on the other hand, there's also the idea of phronesis. If you recall from the previous lectures, the idea of phronesis is the idea of practical wisdom. And phronesis sort of brings in this question of not whether I am technically skilled to write an algorithm, but a larger question of should I at all be writing this algorithm, because it can have reactions, it can have repercussions, it can sort of produce inequalities in digital spaces, so on and so forth. So this idea of having the technical know-how to write an algorithm, and the idea of phronesis, or the practical wisdom, or the idea of the episteme, for example, knowledge production, what is all of these going to culminate in and produce as a final output, is at the very, very foundational level of computational thinking. So, the idea of computational thinking, at the very foundation of computational thinking, is the idea of problem specification. That you specify a problem to the machine, to the computer, and give an algorithmic sort of an expression. You design an algorithm, you write an algorithm, and you create these step-by-step instructions for the machine in the language that the machine understands to give you an output or a solution or an evaluation. And so this is, the computational thinking steps that run at the very foundation of how we sort of craft and execute an algorithm. But there also has been a parallel story to this in how, with technological development, the nature of data has sort of evolved, and the nature of how we understand what is data has evolved over time. And this has been a paradigm shift, and this is often also falling under a larger umbrella of for example, digital humanities as an emerging field, or computational social science as an emerging field. But what these emerging fields are looking at is how has the understanding of data evolved over time. For example, what it used to be text as data. If you treat any text, a body of text, as data, to understanding images, right? Images can also be sources of data. You can study an image, you can study a photograph, you can study a postcard, for example, and derive a set of understanding and create a data set out of it. Audio, sound, for example, objects, for example, numbers, for example, machine classification, statistical programs, to the era that we are currently in an era of multimedia and immersive technology, immersive experiences of technology, such as artificial intelligence, augmented reality, virtual reality, mixed reality, and so on and so forth. So, what has happened in this journey is that the idea of computational thinking, the idea of techne and phronesis, has also evolved. And what we see is that if we recall a previous lens that we talked about by Foucault on the context of power and the image, for example, how power is practiced within a relationship of an image and a spectating subject. That what sort of a power geometry is established. So this idea of establishing new power geometries has been possible because of the evolving nature of the data. And just to recall, another theoretical lens that I talked about in the previous part of this topic is the idea of intersectionality. That how can we better look at some of these, mutually constitutiveness of identities and inequalities through the lens of inequalities. So, going back to the question of images and advertisements, for example, we see around us, a bounty of images, a bounty of values that images, in particularly in advertisements, are showcased. And we talked about Stuart Hall in a previous lecture to look at how there are these value rendering, how are the processes of message decoding and encoding taking place through images such as advertisements. A similar example that you can look up, and I think it's freely available on the net, and it's open access, is to look at the study that June Kilborn had done on the effect of technology and advertisements in understanding gender dynamics in given societies. So this is a series of studies that she has done, titled "Killing Us Softly," and you can look at just to get a better understanding of the idea that Stuart Hall, for example, has been talking about, that what happens when we as products of our societies encode and decode images contextualized within that social context. So, with that, I will now move to my next set of examples that talk about the disruptions and discontents around algorithms in digital spaces from a fundamentally social science perspective. So the understanding of artificial intelligence is linked to the idea of word embeddings. And word embeddings are a type of word representation that allows words with similar meaning to have a similar representation. And this is a study that a group of scholars did, about 10 years ago, or maybe 8 years ago. And the title of the study was "Man is to Computer Programmer as Woman is to Homemaker?" Debiasing word embeddings. So what the study has shown is that, so they did a study that was tested on Google News articles, and this was an analogy testing, that the machine was given a set of algorithms to understand an analogy, and then asked a question and asked for an input and an output for that question. So the analogy, the examples that were given to the machine was that if man is a king, is to woman is a queen, Paris is to France, where Tokyo is to Japan, then if man is a computer programmer, is to women, and then this was given a blank. And the machine, based on its algorithmic inputs, was asked, what can a possible answer be? that if man is a computer programmer, what can a woman be? And the answer that the machine returns with is that if man is a computer programmer, then a woman is a homemaker. And this is where questions of inequality, this is where questions of identity negotiation comes in, because as the scholars argue, and it's argued, in general, in a broader scale also, is that for example, computer programming is a profession, not a gendered profession. So, the answer to man is a computer programmer is to woman, ideally should have been is also a computer programmer, because it's a profession. And it's a profession, but the answer that is sort of brought up by the machine in return of this analogy testing is that woman is a homemaker if man is a computer programmer. So then the larger question now becomes, in the context of a social understanding, is the algorithm biased? Is it that the algorithms, that is functioning behind the scene, is the algorithm biased? And the answer to that is possibly better if we understand it is as the creators. It is the human force that is creating the algorithms, and the human technical force is embedded within their social context. And so, how the algorithm is functioning is a reflection of how the technical force, how the technical professionals situated within their particular social contexts are functioning. So, there has been a lot of other studies also which look at computers learning from human writing automatically, that see certain occupational words as masculine and others as feminine. So these are all, looking at how algorithms are created, and of course, algorithms are created by skilled professionals who are products of their, social contexts. There is another example that I would like to use in this context is, and this came out a couple of years ago in the Times of India, is that there was an artist who generated AI generated photos of regional expressions of men and women in India. And there was a lot of discussions around this, this exhibition, this retrieval of photographs, based on this artist's work, because what the discussion was about is that these images were showing stereotypical images of people, men and women, across the country. And the artist actually brings it to everyone's notice is that, the fact that you can see that these images are stereotyped, quote unquote, is because of the algorithms that are retrieving these photographs from a crowdsourced body of resources. And algorithms learn from a library of billions of images, as the artist says. And this was a crowdsourced data set that have been sort of contributed by people across. And the way that the data was tagged is the way that the algorithm retrieved that data. And so, how you tag a data set and then, therefore, what you get in a retrieval format is very closely linked. And this is what the artist has been talking about, that, if we are seeing a stereotypical expression of people in this retrieval process, let's look at how the algorithms or how the crowdsourced data set was created, was tagged, because this is also an expression of these billions of images that is already there in the data set. So there is another very, very important work in this context, and that relates to algorithms and search engines. And this is a work by Safia Noble. The title of the book is Algorithms of Oppression: How Search Engines Reinforce Racism. And in this book, Safia Noble brings in front and center the question of data discrimination as a real social problem. And, Safia Noble actually does an analysis of textual and media searches, and also extensive research, and looks at the way that algorithms are functioning, algorithms are crafted, can lead to concepts of, can lead to problems of data discrimination. So Safia Noble's work in this book also was influenced by the UN Women's ad series campaign, where the UN Women actually looks at the widespread prevalence of discrimination against women through a series of search results, and this is freely available online if you want to take a further look at the autocomplete truth of the UN Women campaign. That what happens when you type in certain keywords in a search engine, and what are some of the results that come up. And so this is the autocomplete truth of the UN Women campaign. There are other activities that you can engage for yourself to get a feel and form of what algorithms do when data is tagged in a certain manner. And if you go to this website, this is a news article with the title Computer Draw a Scientist. Do AI images reject or reflect gender stereotypes? And in this article, the writer actually argues that the idea of photographs, idea of pictures, have a power geometry, and this is something we have discussed before in the other lecture. Is that they shape how we think, they shape how the world works, they shape who we think we will become, our aspirations, ambitions, so on and so forth. And the idea that AIs, artificial intelligence, is engaging in producing these images, whether rejecting or reflecting gender stereotypes, goes a long way again to understanding how these algorithms have been created. So there are, some of the other activities that you can do for yourself and see, what sort of results are retrieved from the internet based on this engagement of artificial intelligence. For example, if you go to Chat GPT and you ask Chat GPT to write a story, for example, about a homemaker, for example, or a story about a professor, or a story about a doctor, for example, and see for yourself what is the nature of story that ChatGPT is returning you with. What are some of these identity negotiations? What are some of the stratifications, some of these inequalities that ChatGPT is bringing back to you in that sense? Now, going back to the idea of a theoretical framework working together with the idea of a technology interface, the idea of intersectionality and mobilities has been, in the last couple of years, been used by scholars to look at research that is oriented towards immersive technology. For example, there's a lot of work that is going on looking at comics in digital spaces, for example, with the application of intersectionality and mobility to understand the parameters of inequalities, parameters of identity negotiations on digital spaces. So I would like to conclude with a thought for you and leave you there. Is recently there was an article by in one of the leading newspapers that if there is a theory of AI, computer science is unlikely to provide it, and it's a very nicely crafted article that brings into the question that artificial intelligence is something that we often equate with computer science and engineering, but there's a larger question that is guiding the practice, the existence of artificial intelligence, and that larger question is governed by social practices. And so this is something that that I think you can reflect on, because that will bring into question of questions of knowledge production, questions of power negotiation, and how we produce knowledge as a society, how we produce knowledge as a group, whether it is on physical space, whether it is on digital space, with or without the use of technology. So this is an idea that I want to leave you with as a reflection for the idea that when you look at artificial intelligence, when you look at digital spaces, think of it from a social context also, to answer these larger questions of knowledge production in society. Thank you very much.